The unconventional methods used to shape certain ancient megaliths are so extraordinary that one might contemplate the possibility of techniques such as stone softening. But here's the problem. We can chemically affect stone with an acid to create a porous surface. We can also heat it to soften or even melt it. But in any case, irreversible processes occur after our intervention. To soften an igneous rock, it needs to be crushed before firing. How is it possible for the intact rock to undergo softening without destruction and then return to a normal solid state? Based on our current understanding, it may seem impossible, but there is evidence at many megalithic sites of tool marks and treatment that suggest the stone material was in a plastic state at some point. And the problem is we don't even understand the physical and chemical basis of such an effect. But it is highly likely that we are on the verge of a big discovery, as we just recently began to build a physical foundation to start comprehending it. The technology we're about to discuss has not been established yet. It resides at the forefront of experimental physics and is continuously evolving. Its implications hold the potential for the next industrial revolution, but more importantly, it can unveil the enigmatic aspects of ancient megalithic technology, such as the stone softening, precise cutting, and transportation methods. Furthermore, this technology helps to explain certain anomalies that are difficult to clarify through other means.
No difficulty lifting large pieces into place. Liquefaction and molding of structures. Particle beam cutting.
Kenneth Shoulders, an experimental physicist attributed the title Father of Vacuum of Microelectronics, was working together with his son to replicate a plasmoid phenomenon observed by Winston Bostick in his laboratory. Later, Shoulders was granted 5 U.S. patents for his discovery and advancement in the area of high-density charge cluster technology. According to Shoulders, this phenomenon is an autonomous, highly condensed matter state. He believed it was a cluster of electrons that channeled energy, although the source of that energy was uncertain. He was able to bore microscopic holes in various materials using the energy of such clusters. This state he believed to be an assembly of electrons created through the powerful electric field and can also be seen as plasma structures in multiple toroidal form. Shoulders observed that these structures are neutral and highly penetrative, capable of interacting with ordinary matter. They do not necessarily conform to the definition of condensed plasmoids, as they can exist without ions or electrons. Are they purely electromagnetic phantoms? At the same time, the phantom that needs to be made or clustered first, such phantoms once made can carry ions and electrons. He called their collective state EVO, an abbreviation for exotic vacuum objects. EVOs seem to defy the known laws of physics. Under normal circumstances, electrons should not be able to form clusters, as stated by Shoulders, as they carry negative charges that repel each other. One of the key characteristics of these electron ensembles is a self-contained electron plasma that creates a collective state with very exotic properties. Once produced, they tend to stay locked like shadows of themselves in the material indefinitely. The possible explanation is that they are quantum locked into the matter that surrounds them, kind of magnetically attached to the nucleuses of atoms. They can interact with matter in ways that electric and magnetic fields cannot, and interact with matter that are immune to these fields. And it might happen that some variations of a technology very similar to this were discovered in ancient times and utilized in various locations to construct megalithic structures. Exotic vacuum objects are responsible for very strange effects. Such effects were noticed first by John Hutchison in his laboratory, even though he didn't attribute them to this technology, and it is known today as the Hutchison effect. He showcased remarkable effects, including lifting, embedding of materials, and metal transmutation. While some claim his videos are fraudulent, the anomalous metal samples produced are available for analysis. Metal extrusion and transmutation effects are notably less commonly debunked. And what is very interesting is that there are fascinating similarities between the anomalous effects observed in the metal samples obtained by John Hutchison and some very ancient ones found in megalithic stone sites. Here is a physicist and professional engineer, George Hathaway, discussing the analysis he conducted on one of Hutchison's anomalous metal samples.
The other thing that is significant about this is that if you examine it closely, you can see bits of copper that have come out of solution, in my opinion. I mean, it was an alloy with copper, but the alloying elements did not suddenly sort of come out of solution and congeal into blobs of the alloy element. It comes out as copper. In this case, there's probably molybdenum and some other alloying elements that are certainly impossible to see with the naked eye if they're well alloyed. But only under circumstances that I'm holding here have I ever seen blobs of the alloying element.
See it.
Yes, actually somehow migrate out of solution and into a blob that is big enough to see.
Right.
And that happens at the grain boundaries, as we found in some of the analyses of these things too.
It is intriguing how this effect bears resemblance to certain ancient occurrences, such as these pictograms discovered during 2012's geophysical expedition in Peru on a large carved stone called Chincana at Kenco. What appears to be a white paint on the stone actually turns out to be anomalous pictograms created using an unidentified technique. The pictograms formed by white crystal inclusions within the stone's structure that seems like it migrated and self-organized on the surface. Upon closer examination, one can see that the writing is extremely ancient and gives the impression that quartz crystals were somehow moved to form a pattern or writing, somewhat similar to how copper separated itself from the alloy and formed clusters in the Hutchison sample. These anomalies in metal and stone share similarities, which could indicate common features of this technology and should be investigated further. However, metal and stone are very different materials. How can it be similar then?
But also, John Hutchison found that even non-magnetic materials became magnetic. But more interestingly, is that this looks like the same kind of effect, but imbued onto a structure that has lasted for a very long time. And the thing that I know, it's not necessarily just magnetics. In my view, exotic vacuum objects can stay, as Shoulders said, indefinitely in materials, particularly metals. And there is metals in basalt.
Basalt is a volcanic rock that is comparatively rich in iron and magnesium and quartz. Granite is a rock that is rich in quartz and feldspar. And in the Andes, we have a specific one, andesite rocks that consist essentially of feldspar and one or more ferromagnetic compounds. What do you find in quartz? Quartz is a mineral made up of oxide of silicon, while feldspars are a group of minerals containing aluminum and silicon that forms rocks. Silicon is a semi-metal. To use this technology, all that is required is resonance with the silicon and oxygen found in quartz. All of such materials seem compatible with EVO-based technology. This would theoretically allow softening the stone, precision cutting, and transportation of any weight. The current theory of how this exotic vacuum object technology might work is as follows. Once the block is energized and EVOs begin to accumulate, grow, and self-organize within the structure of the rock, they start interacting with the atomic composition of the stone. This interaction has the potential to quantumly lock the exotic vacuum objects to the surrounding matter, locking themselves to the atomic nucleus. This lock is indefinite. If these objects grow large enough, they have the potential to link together, resembling beads on a necklace. As a result, they may produce intermediate structures that exhibit characteristics similar to what physicists call pseudomagnetic monopoles. They call them pseudomagnetic because they exhibit magnetic-like properties similar to a predicted magnetic monopole. Since these predicted particles possess a single magnetic pole, they could allow for the precise control and manipulation of magnetic fields. For example, it is predicted that magnetic monopoles can alter and redirect the Earth's magnetic field, creating a shield that changes its direction and intensity. This shield can repel or redirect magnetic fields, enabling levitation and effortless transportation of heavy objects. Now, we don't know for sure how the short burst of energy that creates strong electromagnetic fields can make the electrons come together and form a cluster, even though they should be repelling each other due to their electric charges. What we know, though, is that such an effect is observed in superconductors. Some researchers suggest that this effect is directly linked to a magnetic monopole. It gathers electrons into pairs and arranges them in spatial order. Once these structures are created and self-organized in a collective electron plasma state, they might allow the manipulation of stone material in a different and exotic way. Depending on the level of energy supplied to EVOs within, the stone, similar to the metal in Hutchison samples, can be softened to mold the structures. It can even be liquefied without breaking its structure. The important thing is that this technology doesn't heat the stone. It will stay cold, thus can be manipulated even by hand or by very simple tools. In this study, the characteristics of a moving exotic vacuum object was researched. They described such electron bunches behaving like an electron plasma fluid in their experiments. Such ability for indefinite lock with a stone structure and then creating intermediate highly magnetic structures, superconductivity, and superfluid effects possibly paved the way for truly magical effects. One of them, the solid stone itself, can start behaving like a jelly. And this can explain some anomalous tool traces on ancient objects. For instance, consider the markings found on the megaliths in the Sacsayhuaman region in southern Peru. They bear resemblance to the work done on a material in its plastic state. The markings look like they've been effortlessly imprinted on soft clay rather than stone. A striking resemblance can be observed between the traces found on the micro level of the metal treated by exotic vacuum object technology and those present on the megalithic block in the wall. In Kenko, there is a location where the limestone exhibits a peculiar appearance as if it had melted and solidified like a puddle. But it's known that limestone cannot be melted under normal circumstances. When subjected to high temperatures, it loses its properties and crumbles. Now, there are even more remarkable artifacts, one of which was discovered during archaeological excavations near the Temple of the Moon. Its significance lies in the fact that the marks of its processing have not been eroded. It's difficult to fathom a primitive tool capable of leaving such distinct traces. Etching or even tapping wouldn't be sufficient to create them. The closest resemblance is the mark left by a red-hot tip on plastic. Now, interestingly, it bears a resemblance to the macroscopic imprint that would be left by the ball lightning in laboratory experiments. One of the very interesting features of this technology is that it is also capable of enveloping the whole object it interacts with. And as a result, such a stone block would be magnetized, which will also be creating magnetic anomalies in it. It's because exotic vacuum objects are locked to the atomic structure inside and stay indefinitely in blocks. After being energized, they leave magnetic anomalies in the rock, same as in the metal. Now, such anomalies will have specific features and can become the hallmark of technology because these balls of fire tend to self-organize around corners or angles between flat surfaces.
These ball of fires, as they're called in the 2001 fusion technology paper, congregating or self-organizing on the edges. And if you actually look, when he's moving the compass around across this H block, when he gets to the edges, or he's in the center, or he's moving into the center of the block, he is seeing magnetic anomalies. And if you can imagine, if you had the balls of fire at the corners, that's where you would create a localized magnetic anomaly. It would be, if the whole block had an overall kind of EVO magnetic field, it would focus into the center.
Here is the initial option for verifying this theory then. Examining magnetic anomalies found on other megaliths, as they may indicate potential locations where such technology was utilized.
I would suggest to you that if you went to look at Nan Madol, you would also find magnetic anomalies on those basalt rocks. That just as I found out earlier today in the rocks at Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, that they are on the edges, just as we observed on this bolt, where the balls of fire self-organize. Well, what it would do is it would leave a magnetic anomaly at this end, and it would leave a different magnetic anomaly at this end.
How can one utilize the effect of balls of fire attached to the edges? It can be extremely beneficial for orienting and positioning megalithic blocks.
The ball of fire got locked to the piece of material even after it cut, and wherever it moved around, it was stuck at that end. And also that it could magnetically align at this entire piece. So what I'm saying is that you don't actually have to have coherent matter all over the object for it to be able to manipulate it. It's at the ends. Now we know that that could lock in place. And we know that when that's locked in place, we have two effective manipulation points on this object. Now, if we had an anti-gravity craft above, and we had these two balls of lightning as we see at the either end of these structures here, and if they can both act as manipulation points, you can have your AG craft pull up this one side or the other side to manipulate it into position.
Now, as anti-gravity craft is not even required, it could simply be a platform or even the Earth itself, or something that serves as an energy emitter, generating exotic vacuum objects within the treated object. The stone protrusions on certain megaliths resemble points of manipulation as well. Since these exotic vacuum objects have a tendency to self-organize around angled surfaces or protrusions, it's possible that one of the protrusions' functions was block orientation and placement. Is it possible that ancient builders left them on the stones as evidence of their magical technology? What's even more fascinating is that, in accordance with this theory, the highly complex shape of the H-blocks found at Pumapunku can be explained in surprising ways.
It might be that the H-blocks were specifically designed so that when you put a beam of coherent matter down onto it, to a certain degree, that it self-organized on the block and gave orientation, self-organization areas on there so that you didn't need any ground crew, okay? It could just be an engineering solution. The balls of fire self-organizing on these edges. And I think it may actually be extremely deliberate that it has this cutout. And this form, therefore, allows them to easily orient these structures with the AG craft and put them into place to build any structure they like.
Another intriguing and testable feature of utilizing this technology is that exotic vacuum objects have the capability to transmute the material they come in contact with.
I would imagine that this material here from John Hutchison is absolutely chock-a-block of exotic vacuum objects. That if I drop this, I will ask you, does this sound like aluminium? Ow, just made a hole in my computer. That does not sound to me like aluminium. It should sound much more dud, okay? And this took me an extremely long time with a hacksaw to cut. This is not your average aluminium. But when we looked with an XRF at the end of this, it was reading technetium, it was reading all kinds of things, but it wasn't reading all the spectral lines. This is not aluminium anymore. It's not any element in the middle here, okay? Yeah, way too high pitch. Now, this is very interesting because this isn't the only thing that will have high pitch.
Similarly, stones from a variety of ancient megalithic sites produce a ringing, high-pitched sound that is quite similar if you tap on them. Some people have suggested that it may be some kind of nuclear transmutation going on inside. Another option is that exotic vacuum objects can induce the migration and alignment of natural impurities either towards or to the side of the active zone within a stone. So when a material jellifies, the impurities congeal, almost like a surface tension on water. This is another aspect that can be used as a rapid test, as a correlation exists between the presence of such anomalies in the finished blocks and the unfinished ones.
Now, the interesting thing that he noticed in this, which is consistent with this theory, is that on the unfinished blocks, there were much less magnetic anomalies. And on the finished blocks, the ones that look really finished, that's where you had the strong magnetic anomalies.
The exotic vacuum objects technology goes hand in hand with another, known as coherent matter. It refers to a state of matter similar to that in a laser. In this state, the motion of the particles in matter becomes highly ordered and they start to behave as a single entity. This technology exists, as there are several coherent matter beam generator patents already. Now, if we envision a cloud of coherent matter surrounding the stone block and energizing it, it would also magnetize the block, enabling the effortless lifting and precise placement of any megaliths with any weight.
So if you want to beam someone up, you would put coherent matter around them, and then you would use this controllable north-south focused magnetic beam. And because these things are so highly magnetic, the coherent matter, you could then pull someone up into your ship, or you could pull something up or pull it down. And if you had a little array of these little magnetic beam devices, and you had beamed down coherent matter and it had gone round your H block and it had focused on the corners and it self-organized. Now, I don't believe that the coherent matter machining tools would actually cause magnetic anomalies that are that macro. But I think the AG side of it, actually moving things into positioning and dropping them down and locating them, that's when you are really putting a large amount of coherent matter over the object and you're really spinning up.
The very first experiments with the coherent matter were done at absolute zero, but the Lockheed Martin patent suggests that it could be produced at any temperature. Thus, innovative tools with cutting precision and unimaginable power become possible. Such a tool would be somewhat similar to the laser, but much more effective. Such a coherent matter tool will be able to cut any type of granite, any type of basalt, or any type of harder rocks literally like butter.
With a laser, where the photons have no mass, you are able to cut steel inches thick. In the case of a coherent matter wave, you have electrons or protons or even tungsten ions in there. These can do an unimaginably more energetic process. Cutting through very deep or large amounts of rock should be fairly trivial. And we know absolutely certainly that this is what's happening in terms of quartz, because as I have shared in the past, we have had strange radiation, exotic vacuum objects bore through fused quartz here, which normally melts at over 1700 degrees centigrade. And so this is like even better than a lot of rock, if you know what I mean. But it can go straight the way through. And alumina, which is 2100 degrees centigrade, aluminium oxide, Ken Shoulders showed boreholes through that. And this is just something that's happening by statistics. Whereas if you're doing something like is in the Lockheed Martin patent, where they are actually creating a beam of coherent matter, really there is almost nothing. In fact, I would argue there is literally nothing that could withhold this kind of thing back. And maybe, I think probably non-conductive things which would dissipate energy readily would be the least likely to be affected by it. So things like thin sheets of paper. Paper survives, metal and rock doesn't. It's a bit strange. These things are all very Star Trek and would probably explain why Ken Shoulders and John Hutchison spent a good period of time with the writers and producers of Star Trek to tell them what they needed to put into their programs so that people, could accept this technology, because these were things that were possible. And we definitely have it in this patent from 2013 from Lockheed Martin.
What about the actual tools used in ancient times? And how did the ancients achieve such effects without huge amounts of energy like we would do? The technology employed should rely on natural phenomena and possess both fundamental and widespread effects. One of the potential options is cold fusion, also known as low-energy nuclear reaction. It's a type of nuclear reaction that occurs at or near room temperature.
Cold fusion is the same thing that did this. It's the same thing that built Nan Madol and probably all of the megalithic structures. And it's much, much simpler than they would have you believe.
Now, tools could be as sophisticated as modern-day tools, but ancient tools could also be so basic that we might not even recognize them as such. Regarding metal tools, this technology behaves differently when interacting with various metal structures. However, there have been observations that suggest brass is highly responsive to this type of technology. It's likely a certain type of bronze would be as well. Electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver with traces of copper and other metals, was utilized in the Old Kingdom of Egypt as early as the 3rd millennium BC. It is highly conductive and could have played its role in this technology. Interestingly, metals are not always necessary when it comes to this technology, as there are aspects of it that don't require them at all. This opens up new frontiers in physics and makes one think about what some of the first ancient tools may have looked like. Michael Tellinger has discovered several typical extremely ancient tool sets in South Africa, including Taurus stones and cone-shaped tools, which are among the artifacts on display at the Stones Circle Museum.
Now, the Taurus is interesting, I'll come to that, but the spiky tool is what I would suggest you held in your hands. So what you're doing is you're having an anti-gravity thing, like a ball lightning. It's floating in the air. It's floating in the air. So this is our piece of basalt, and it's floating in the air. If it goes to ground, it'll kind of lose its charge, and it'll be stuck there. But let's say we've got it here, and it's floating in the air. And I come along with my preconditioned piece of material, like this Hutchison material, and I come along to it, and I can grab it. And it wants to attach to me because the exotic vacuum objects, some of them, are discharging through my body to ground, okay? Now, we all know with high-frequency electricity from Tesla coils, you can grab the Tesla coil and you can grab a light bulb over here and the power will go through your body. And that's why you have a spiky thing, okay? And 2 of them allows you to manipulate it. 1 doesn't really, it's not very good, but 2 allows you to rotate it in any axis you like.
The use of this technology and tools might be known from antediluvian history, and it might be preserved as a tradition in various cultures, like in ancient Sumer. These cone-shaped objects, called votive cones, were hidden in the walls and under the floors of significant buildings during construction. They served to commemorate the construction of the temple. Afterwards, these cones were stored within the walls or concealed in secret chambers.
And the thing is, if you listen to Michael Tellinger, he says that these stones sound very high frequency when you drop them. Oh, that's interesting.
Now, as we've seen from the example of Pumapunku and other similar cases, a new pattern is emerging. This technology has the ability to affect matter in a special way, and one of the potential signs of its use is a high-pitched sound. Moreover, the Taurus tool is particularly intriguing, as it appears to have an extremely strong magnetic anomaly. According to Tellinger, this Taurus stone was able to crash the TSA security system at Doha International Airport in 2013, simply by being carried through it.
I think, and this is just a speculation I have like right now, the Taurus is basically, it's a lifting device. It's kind of like a halfway house. These things charged up, they are treated. They're treated. And by then re-energizing the exotic vacuum objects that are in there, you can then use those to lift things. And how do you lift them? Well, you put a rope through the hole. And because the rope, in Africa, they make ropes of sisal. It's basically cellulose. And we already know that cellulose really doesn't get affected by this technology. Okay, you could put a couple of these around, energize them, they're up in the air, and then you could move anything of any weight whatsoever. As long as your ropes don't give way.
As per Micronesian legends, Non-Madol was built by twin sorcerers who possessed the power to levitate the massive stones with their magic. Similarly, a legend in the Tiwanaku region of Peru describes the megalithic blocks rising above the ground in a miraculous manner and flying to their desired location. The crucial point is that this technology interacts with biology constantly. In fact, according to Ken Shoulders, the most straightforward way to produce EVO is by emitting them from fingertips. While they can be found in gross electrical discharges like lightning and sparks, they are not practical in that state. However, they become much more practical when producing coherent matter, which can be used to move and cut blocks and adjust their size and shape. We now know that coherent matter exists and can be generated using dielectric barrier discharge. This is essentially a spark produced from a point source, such as a piece of metal or your fingertips. So, as strange as it sounds, your bare hand could be your tool.
If you had this, you could just move left and right. As you layered your rock down, you go until it perfectly fitted. Done. If you had something that was treated like this, remember what Ken Shoulders said, the exotic vacuum objects are in here indefinitely, right? This is forever changed. And if I had something that was treated with the same technology over here, which is the other piece of the plasmoid you just saw, with the same coherent type of matter, then if I came along with this, which has not been used for a long time, and came over to here, it would re-excite it. So if I made a piece of material that had coherent matter in it, and it's dormant, and I'm down on the ground, and I've got my material over here, the quarry craft comes down, and I come along and I hold it in my hand. I don't get a spark from it, and I just want to get the tip interacting with that plasma. And then I can manipulate that around because it kind of phase locks itself. Like that. In fact, if we had one in both hands, you could grab it and you could orient it. It would weigh about the weight of one electron. Okay? It would physically be there. You could see it, but you could move it around with two pointy things. You could move it around, orient it like that. And you know what? All you need to do then is hose it down with some water to kind of settle it in or ground it. These things will go to ground. So basically, you would probably want to do these on dry day.
The selection of variation of such technology and the specific method of construction would depend on the materials that were locally available and the specifics of the area.
Different variations of this technology were deployed in different locations where whoever it was that was using it wanted to construct buildings because they were using the local material on the ground, right? So they go over here, we've got great building material, we can use this, we can cut it. And you know, I imagine it was nothing more than like an architect deciding whether to use steel or glass. Who in their right mind, if they had this technology, would go and dig some chalk and make it into Portland cement? So if you're building structures like the pyramids, you would have a large ground crew that would cut using the coherent matter tools on the ground. Then you would use your AG tools to lift the blocks into place and maybe your cones to position them. In places where you had ready-made basaltic prismatic columns, these are absolutely ideal. You lift them out, you charge them up, and then you can position them down.
It's interesting to note that when John Hutchison first reported the phenomenon he discovered, it generated a great deal of interest from both the government and private sectors. However, despite numerous attempts, almost no one was able to successfully replicate the effect. George Hathaway, a professional engineer who was hired to investigate the phenomena from a scientific standpoint, made an interesting note in his paper related to a decade of research and analysis, stating, "The inevitable conclusion from these observations is that the apparatus plays no primary role in producing the phenomena constituting the Hutchison effect. There have been several physics-based theories which have been put forward to explain the Hutchison effect. All are essentially useless. What remains is that John Hutchison himself is an active part of the system, perhaps even the main part. In the absence of any reasonable physical theory, we are left with psychokinesis as a possible, however unlikely and ill-defined at present, explanation of the Hutchison effect." End of quote. Now, this note is intriguing and prompts the question of whether the mind can influence matter, which is also known as psychokinesis. While this idea is still largely speculative, connection between the mind and the material world might be possible. There is an article, PK Party History, written by Jack Houck. He managed a research lab at a big aerospace company, but in his free time, he pursued his growing interest in psychokinesis through experimental and scientific research. When he examined the metal samples that displayed anomalous bending, he made an intriguing discovery using a scanning electron microscope. In his article, he states that it is postulated that somehow the mind is creating the conditions for energy of unknown form to be deposited along the grain boundaries of the metal. The form of the energy as it is transduced into the metal grain boundaries make a large portion of the metal to have soft grain boundaries. The grains are free to slip or float, and the metal temporarily loses its rigidity. The remarkable observation he made was the occurrence of anomalous effects on the grain boundaries. This effect closely resembles what Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto observed in his cold fusion experiments, where the microball lightning phenomena formed along the metal's grain boundaries.
So here we have this palladium here, which was in a palladium deuterium experiment. And then they cut it in half and they found these features inside the palladium. What's happened is it's come to the crystal boundaries here, and it started to eat away at the crystal boundaries. And he actually sketches the process. Now, so you get these little coherent balls appearing on the crystal boundaries here in our palladium. They kind of chew it out until they start disintegrating the actual material.
Furthermore, this aligns with George Hathaway's findings in his research on metal samples affected by the Hutchison effect, where similar anomalies were observed along the metal grains. But there is more to it. In that article, he stated another very important observation. Quote, "The objective was to assemble a group of people and create a peak emotional experience. The author postulated that at the time of the peak emotional event, the mind could make a connection with the object and affect that object, i.e. psychokinesis. And also, the attendees were testing the silverware to see if it was willing to bend." Now, let's hold that thought for a moment, even though all of this sounds quite strange, as we'll need to recall this later. It's worth noting that the phenomenon observed in metals is similar to what we see in ancient stones, which could be partly due to the presence of metals within certain rocks. When an exotic plasmatic state is locked with a material, it starts to behave like a jelly or a soft material. This could happen in both stone and metal, which can become jelly-like or even fluid-like if there is exotic vacuum objects technology involved, causing really weird effects. It's interesting to note that some individuals famous for their ability to bend metal claim that they do not directly affect the metal, but instead rely on a helping force. Here's a very interesting addition to such claims coming from the Monroe Institute. During the early experiments with the Gateway experience at Stanford Research Institute, one of the participants, an anonymous physicist, was put into a technology-induced altered and expanded state of consciousness. He was asked a series of questions. One of them was, what kind of energy do some people use to affect matter?
Inclination that there were almost like others or a third party involved, the energy that was utilizing. He says you need to get the people to help you out. You need to get the I don't know, whoever they are to be cooperative. I don't know. I just get a they. They're a somebody else. They're like a separate task force, so to speak, a different group that utilizes this energy primarily, or this mind to matter energy as a primary tool rather than the communication type energy.
Is not this kind of energy a means of manipulating physical matter?
Yes, it is. I almost, I do. I get the feeling, or I get the information that it's what you're doing is really getting the cooperation of the physical object itself to change its form. So the spoon re-alters its form, not because forces and pressures or temperatures have forced it to a new form, but rather it is an interaction between the material itself and this energy, which is different than thought energy, but focused and controlled by the mind. And it's almost a cooperative thing. It's not that the metal is pushed into bending, but the metal sort of bends itself. It's almost as if the metal becomes the servant or obeys the desire of the individual and restructures itself.
Now, this willing to bend and the concept of a task force are very important things, because such a task force description sounds exactly the same as ancient Egyptians described their neiters, the term that is usually translated as the gods. In ancient times, the term neiter referred to active principles that occurred periodically, which were the causes of various phenomena. Unfortunately, this term has been broadly translated as God, leading to confusion when referring to pharaonic gods. The concept of neiter in pharaonic Egypt was distinct from the deistic concept of God as the creator with free will situated outside of the world. Rather, pharaonic Egypt made a clear distinction between metaphysical neiters, cosmic neiters, and neiters responsible for natural events that specifically concerned humanity. In pharaonic Egypt, the neiters represented the principles that governed the creation of forms. These principles also had features defining the very essence of life. They were anthropomorphized, but they were not humanized like the gods of Olympus. And it's important to note that although the neiters are conscious principles, they don't possess free will or the ability to make deliberate choices. Does such neiter-conscious principles sound like a task force? And here is a similarly interesting parallel with a quote willing to bend, but from another part of the world. In ancient legends and stories of Incas related to megalithic structures, they talk about use of manual labor, the magical help of the earth, and the desire of the stone itself to be moved. This desire of stone to be moved is basically identical to the willing to bend, as it was reported in cases of psychokinesis. Now, it may sound odd to us since we don't perceive the world in the same way as the ancients. It appears that to them, the strict separation between animate and inanimate was not as clear-cut. They viewed everything in the world as being alive to some degree, but with varying levels of vitality, so to speak. While hard distinctions between living and non-living things persist, modern biologists are beginning to express ideas that align more closely with the worldview of ancient cultures. Michael Levin, a synthetic biologist from Tufts University, highlighted this in his article. Many different types of cognition, from the simplest mechanisms to complex thought, illustrate that cognitive system is not a binary designation like animate or inanimate, but rather a step on a continuum of computational capacity along which very diverse systems can be placed. In a similar vein, the ancient notion of living stones that could self-organize their shape and even desire to be moved may accurately reflect what was occurring. This closely resembles how the advanced Evo technology would manifest itself. Now, it's important to note that exotic vacuum objects are constantly interacting with biology. In fact, according to Ken Shoulders, the simplest way to produce them is by emitting them from fingertips. We still don't understand the full capacity of us as an extremely complex biological system. Professor Alexander Dobrov sought to expand on this idea in his concept of biogravity. His hypothesis suggests that humans are capable of creating a biogravitational field and derive energy from the biophysical vacuum, allowing them to interact with fundamental natural processes. The manifestation of biogravitation is a force field component created by mental effort and directed by human consciousness. This differs fundamentally from natural gravitational fields. His hypothesis explains various parapsychological phenomena and implies that human thought is a universal energy field substance that can transform into any type of matter and interact with virtual particles and fields of the physical vacuum.
The normal reality deals with the atom-molecule level of physical reality. Connectivity between the atom-molecule level of reality and the vacuum level of reality. In the normal reality, the connectivity is very, very small. In the theory, there has to be some in order for electromagnetism exists of any form. Consciousness seems to lift the symmetry state, and in practical terms, it means that the connectivity between the atom-molecule level and the vacuum level increases. It's as if they're parallel universes, all right? And you can only measure in one universe. So in the normal reality, it's as if this is unconnected because you can't get a signature with your instruments. But with consciousness, which lifts the gauge symmetry state, which is also a higher thermodynamic free energy state, then it increases this coupling and we begin to access the physics of the vacuum, which appears to be very much related to magnetic monopoles, as well as a whole variety of other things. And accessing that new physics allows intention to bring forth effects you wouldn't imagine.
Now, considering that, it can be assumed that biogravitational and biovacuum processes affect the entire functioning of an organism, its physical condition and operation, as a giant macro-quantum system where bioenergetic processes occur and fields and matter are transformed within it. According to this theory, humans have the ability to not just generate the exotic vacuum objects and coherent matter using biological means, but also to control and manipulate it. And lastly, there is another important aspect to the system of a man and megaliths, the magical help of the earth.
Because you know how these things like fit on a ball, like the earth is a ball, you can then know that you will get, in fact, on these balls, there are structures that form. They self-organize in a particular place. And I imagine that's exactly what happened on Earth. And what I am saying, the Earth is created, as the whole solar system is created, by a macro one of these structures falling down. On the Earth, you have these little, you see these little spots? These are where balls of fire formed, and they changed the structure. And there is energy. What I'm saying is there was a ball of fire there. I'm saying that these things stay in the material. There's like a shadow of themselves in the material indefinitely. And maybe that's exactly what happened on Earth. And the Earth had these structures on there. And if you had the right scanning technology, you could come along and go, well, there's one there, there's one there, there's one. And that's where we're going to build our buildings, because we can use that energy that's in the structure that was there when the Earth was made, or where that part of the Earth is. As you know, you can do it with absolutely precisely with these wonderful tools that make it basically effortless. Then you can just focus on, is it pointing in the right direction? Have we got it on some sort of energy vortex that's on the Earth? These kind of things you can start toying with.
So, complex organized plasmatic structures called EVOs can be created naturally and exist in certain places on Earth, and ancient people may have discovered them and made tools from the treated stone material that was present. Eventually, they may have learned how to interact with these structures and advanced their technology. Since these plasmatic balls of fire have a tendency to self-organize, they can arrange themselves in geometric patterns. This might explain why some megalithic structures appear to be aligned on the same line on the planet. There are several other fascinating aspects of this technology that warrant further investigation. However, the most critical aspect is that it presents possibilities for experimental tests in the future to determine if it can help solve yet another piece of the larger puzzle.
Yeah, I think what you'll find is that this technology basically answers all of the mysteries of the ancient religious texts. And if you were seeing people essentially move around chunks of mountain, they would just look like gods to you.